They called it the land without a people for a people without a land. That was a lie, and what happened next changed the Middle East forever. In 1947, the United Nations made a decision that would spark one of the longest conflicts in modern history. They voted to divide Palestine into two states, one for Jews, one for Arabs. Sounds fair, right? Except there was one massive problem. The people living there never got a say. And within a year, over 700,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes. This is the story of how it all began, how it escalated, and why it still matters today. To understand what happened in Palestine, you need to go back further than 1947, way further, because this story doesn't start with the United Nations. It starts in the late 1800s with a movement called Zionism. Zionism was born in Europe during a time when Jewish communities faced horrible persecution, pogroms in Russia, discrimination across the continent, the Dreyfus Affair in France. Jewish people were looking for safety, for a homeland where they could live without fear. And a journalist named Theodor Herzl had an idea. He proposed creating a Jewish state. The location, Palestine. Now here's where things get complicated. Palestine wasn't empty. It wasn't some barren desert waiting for people to show up. In the late 1800s, Palestine was home to around 500,000 people. Most of them were Arab Muslims, but there were also Arab Christians and a small Jewish community that had lived there for generations. They had towns, farms, businesses, families. They had lives. But to many Zionist leaders, this didn't matter much. Some genuinely believed the land was mostly empty. Others knew it wasn't but thought the Arab population could be moved or would leave on their own. And some just didn't care. They needed a homeland, and Palestine was the place they chose. At first, Jewish immigration to Palestine was small, a few thousand here and there. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine at the time, didn't pay much attention. But then World War I happened, and everything changed. In 1917, the British issued something called the Balfour Declaration. It was a letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader in the British Jewish community. And in that letter, Britain promised to support the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Just like that. No consultation with the people living there. No vote. Just a promise from one foreign power to another group about someone else's land. When World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Britain took control of Palestine under something called a mandate from the League of Nations, and with British support, Jewish immigration started to increase. By the 1920s, tensions were rising. Arab Palestinians saw what was happening. They saw more and more land being bought by Jewish organizations. They saw new settlements popping up, and they started to worry about their future. In 1929, violence erupted in Hebron and other cities. Over 100 people died, both Arabs and Jews. The British tried to calm things down, but the problem kept growing. By the 1930s, Jewish immigration had surged even more because of what was happening in Europe. Hitler had come to power in Germany. Jewish people were fleeing for their lives, and many of them came to Palestine. Between 1933 and 1936, the Jewish population in Palestine doubled. The Arab population watched this happen with increasing alarm. They protested. They demanded limits on immigration and land sales. And when the British didn't listen, they revolted. The Arab Revolt lasted from 1936 to 1939. It was a full-scale uprising against British rule and Jewish immigration, strikes, boycotts, armed attacks. The British crushed it with brutal force. They demolished homes. They imposed curfews. They executed rebels. By the time it was over, thousands of Palestinians were dead or imprisoned. The revolt had failed, but the anger didn't go away. Then World War II happened, and the Holocaust changed everything. 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. It was genocide on an unimaginable scale. After the war, there were hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors with nowhere to go. Many countries, including the United States and Britain, refused to take them in. So they wanted to go to Palestine. And now, after the Holocaust, the idea of a Jewish homeland wasn't just a political movement. It felt like a moral necessity. But for Palestinians, this didn't change the fundamental problem. They sympathized with what Jewish people had suffered, but they asked a simple question: why should we pay the price for Europe's crimes? By 1947, Britain had had enough. They couldn't control the situation anymore. Jewish militant groups like the Irgun and Lehi were carrying out attacks against British forces. Arab Palestinians were still angry and resistant. So Britain handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations and said, "You deal with it." The UN came up with a plan: partition. They would divide Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. Jerusalem would be an international city. On paper, it might have sounded reasonable, but the details were a disaster. The Jewish state would get 55% of the land, even though Jews made up only about a third of the population and owned less than 7% of the land. The Arab state would get 45%, even though Arabs were the majority. And the borders were absurd. The two states would be broken into pieces, with Jewish and Arab areas scattered and disconnected. It was a recipe for conflict. On November 29, 1947, the UN voted, 33 countries in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions. The plan passed. Jewish leaders accepted it even though many wanted more. Arab leaders rejected it completely. They saw it as theft, and they weren't going to let it happen without a fight. The very next day, violence broke out. Arab and Jewish militias clashed across Palestine. Buses were attacked. Neighborhoods were bombed. People were killed. And over the next few months, the violence escalated into a full civil war. What happened next is one of the most contested parts of this entire story. It's called the Nakba. In Arabic, that means the catastrophe, and for Palestinians, that's exactly what it was. Between late 1947 and 1949, over 700,000 Palestinians fled or were forced from their homes. That was more than half the Arab population of Palestine. Entire villages were emptied. Cities were abandoned. Families were torn apart, and they never came back. For decades, there's been a debate about why this happened. Did Palestinians leave on their own? Were they ordered to leave by Arab leaders? Or were they forced out by Jewish militias? The answer is complicated, but historians have done the work, and the evidence is clear. Some Palestinians did leave because they were scared. War was raging, and people fled to safety, thinking they'd return in a few weeks, but many were forced out. Jewish militias carried out operations specifically designed to depopulate Arab areas. They destroyed villages. They massacred civilians to spread fear. They told people to leave or die. One of the most infamous incidents happened in the village of Deir Yassin in April 1948. Members of the Irgun and Lehi militias attacked the village and killed over 100 people. Men, women, children. The massacre spread terror across Palestine. People in other villages heard what happened and fled before the militias arrived. This wasn't random chaos. There were plans. One of them was called Plan Dalit. It was a military strategy that included provisions for the expulsion of Palestinian civilians from certain areas. Jewish military leaders knew that a Jewish state with a large Arab population would be unstable, so they made sure there wouldn't be one. By the time the dust settled, over 400 Palestinian villages had been destroyed. Some were bulldozed. Some were repopulated with Jewish immigrants. Some just disappeared from the map. And the people who lived there became refugees. They ended up in camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, places where they're still living today, more than 75 years later. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The very next day, 5 Arab countries invaded: Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. They said they were coming to help the Palestinians and stop the creation of Israel, but the war didn't go the way they planned. Israel had better organization, better training, and better weapons. By the time the fighting ended in 1949, Israel controlled even more land than the UN partition plan had given them. They now held 78% of historic Palestine. Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. Jordan controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And Palestine as a country no longer existed. For Israelis, this was independence, the birth of their nation, a refuge after centuries of persecution. But for Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the destruction of their society, the loss of their homeland, and the beginning of a life in exile. Now you might think the story ends there, but it doesn't, because the refugees never stopped hoping they'd return, and Israel never let them. In the years after 1948, Israel passed laws that made it impossible for Palestinian refugees to come back. The absentee property law let the Israeli government seize land and homes that belonged to Palestinians who had fled. Jewish immigrants from Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East moved into those homes. They farmed that land, and the original owners were left with nothing. Meanwhile, the refugees lived in camps, tents at first, then concrete blocks. The United Nations set up an agency called UNRWA to provide food, education, and health care. It was supposed to be temporary, but temporary turned into decades, and then generations. Kids were born in those camps. They grew up hearing stories from their parents and grandparents about the villages they came from, about the olive trees they left behind, about the keys to homes that no longer existed. And they grew up angry at Israel for taking their land, angry at the Arab countries for failing to help them, angry at the world for forgetting about them. In the 1950s and 60s, a new generation of Palestinians started organizing. They formed political groups. They demanded their right to return, and some of them picked up weapons. One of those groups was called Fatah. It was founded in 1959 by a man named Yasser Arafat and others. Their goal was simple: liberate Palestine, by force if necessary. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was created. It was supposed to be an umbrella group for all the Palestinian resistance movements. At first, it was controlled by Arab governments. But after 1967, everything changed. In June 1967, another war broke out. It's called the Six-Day War. Israel fought Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and in less than a week, Israel won, decisively. They captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and most importantly for Palestinians, the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Now Israel controlled all of historic Palestine, every inch, and with that land came over 1 million Palestinians who were now under Israeli military rule. They hadn't fled, they had stayed, and now they were occupied. The occupation that started in 1967 is still going on today, and it's brutal. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza live under a system of military law. They can't move freely. They need permits to travel. They face checkpoints, curfews, raids. Their homes can be demolished without trial. They can be arrested and held without charges. In the years after 1967, Israel started building settlements in the occupied territories. These are Jewish-only communities built on Palestinian land. The international community, including the United Nations, says these settlements are illegal, but Israel kept building them anyway. Today, there are over 700,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They have roads, electricity, water. Meanwhile, nearby Palestinian villages struggle with basic services. The settlements aren't just houses. They're part of a strategy. They break up Palestinian land into small, disconnected pieces. They make it nearly impossible to create a viable Palestinian state, and they send a clear message: this land is ours now. For Palestinians living under occupation, life is exhausting. Imagine needing permission to visit your family in the next town. Imagine soldiers raiding your home in the middle of the night. Imagine watching your olive trees get uprooted to make room for a settlement. Imagine your kids growing up seeing tanks in the streets. That's daily life for millions of people, and it's been that way for over 50 years. In the 1970s and 80s, Palestinian resistance took many forms. The PLO carried out armed attacks, including hijackings and bombings. Some of these attacks targeted Israeli military and government sites. Others targeted civilians. And that turned much of the world against the Palestinian cause. People saw the violence and called them terrorists. They stopped listening to the reasons behind the anger. But not all resistance was violent. In 1987, something new happened. It was called the First Intifada. Intifada means uprising in Arabic, and this one was largely nonviolent, at least at first. Palestinians threw stones at Israeli soldiers. They held strikes. They refused to pay taxes. They boycotted Israeli goods. It was a mass movement, and it involved everyone. Kids, women, old men, entire communities. The Israeli response was harsh. Soldiers shot live ammunition at protesters. They broke bones with batons. Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin reportedly gave orders to break the bones of stone throwers. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed. Thousands were injured or imprisoned. But the uprising lasted for years, and it got the world's attention. By the early 1990s, both sides were exhausted. Secret negotiations started in Oslo, Norway. And in 1993, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn. They signed the Oslo Accords. It was supposed to be the beginning of peace. The plan was to create a Palestinian Authority that would govern parts of the West Bank and Gaza. Over time, there would be negotiations for a final peace deal, a two-state solution. Israel and Palestine, side by side. It sounded hopeful, but it fell apart. Hardliners on both sides hated the deal. Israeli settlers didn't want to give up land. Palestinian militants didn't trust Israel, and the violence continued. In 1995, a right-wing Israeli extremist assassinated Yitzhak Rabin because he thought Rabin was giving away too much. And on the Palestinian side, groups like Hamas launched suicide bombings in Israeli cities. Hamas had formed during the First Intifada. It was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and unlike the PLO, which had become more secular and willing to negotiate, Hamas rejected any peace with Israel. They wanted all of historic Palestine back, and they were willing to use violence to get it. The suicide bombings were horrific. Buses, cafes, markets, innocent people blown apart. Israelis were terrified, and the Israeli government responded with more crackdowns, more checkpoints, more restrictions. The cycle of violence just kept spinning. In 2000, the peace process completely collapsed. The Second Intifada began. This one was more violent than the first. Suicide bombings were frequent. Israeli military operations were brutal. Over 4 years, more than 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were killed. Trust was shattered. Hope was gone. In 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. They pulled out all the soldiers and settlers. For a moment, it seemed like maybe this was progress, but Israel kept control of Gaza's borders, airspace, and coastline. It was still essentially a prison. And in 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian elections in Gaza. Israel and the international community refused to recognize them. A civil war broke out between Hamas and Fatah. And when it was over, Hamas controlled Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority controlled parts of the West Bank. Since then, Israel has blockaded Gaza. They control what goes in and what goes out. Food, medicine, building materials, everything is restricted. 2 million people live in Gaza. It's one of the most densely populated places on Earth, and it's been called the world's largest open-air prison. Every few years, war breaks out. Israel launches military operations into Gaza. Hamas fires rockets into Israel. Buildings are destroyed. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, are killed. Most of them are civilians. Most of them are Palestinian. And then a ceasefire is reached, and nothing changes. And a few years later, it happens again. In 2014, over 2,200 Palestinians were killed in a 50-day war. Most were civilians. Entire neighborhoods in Gaza were flattened. Israel said they were targeting Hamas, but the bombs didn't discriminate. Kids playing on a beach were killed. Families sleeping in their homes were killed, and the world watched on TV. For Israelis, the threat is real. Hamas does fire rockets. They have killed Israeli civilians. People in southern Israel live with the constant fear of sirens and bomb shelters. That fear is valid, but the power imbalance is enormous. Israel has one of the most advanced militaries in the world: Iron Dome missile defense, tanks, fighter jets, drones. Hamas has rockets that barely work in tunnels. It's not a fair fight. It's never been a fair fight. And the settlements keep expanding. Every year, more Palestinian land is taken, more homes are demolished, more families are displaced. In East Jerusalem, Palestinian families are being evicted from homes they've lived in for generations so settlers can move in. The Israeli government supports it, Israeli courts approve it, and Palestinians have no legal recourse. There's a word that gets used more and more to describe what's happening: apartheid. Human rights organizations, including Israeli ones like B'Tselem, have used that word. They say Israel operates a system of Jewish supremacy between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, that Palestinians are treated as second-class people, that they live under different laws than Israelis, that they can't vote, can't move freely, can't build without permission that's almost never granted. The Israeli government rejects this. They say it's self-defense. They say Hamas is a terrorist organization. They say they left Gaza. They say they've offered peace deals and Palestinians rejected them. And some of that is true, but it doesn't change what's happening on the ground. Because at the end of the day, millions of Palestinians have been living under military occupation for over 50 years. They have no country, no passport, no freedom, and no hope that things will change. The younger generation of Palestinians is exhausted. They've grown up in camps or under occupation. They've watched their parents and grandparents wait for peace that never comes. Some have given up on politics entirely. Others have joined militant groups, and some are just trying to survive. In the West Bank, young Palestinians face a choice: accept the occupation and try to live a normal life, which is nearly impossible, or resist and risk arrest, injury, or death. Many are arrested as teenagers, thrown in Israeli military prisons without trial. Some are tortured. Some spend years behind bars, and when they get out, they're even angrier than before. In Gaza, the situation is worse. Half the population is under 18. They've lived through multiple wars. They've seen their homes destroyed, their schools bombed, their relatives killed. There's no economy, no jobs. Sewage flows into the sea because the infrastructure is destroyed and Israel won't allow the materials to fix it. Electricity runs a few hours a day. Clean water is scarce. It's unlivable. And yet people are still living there because they have nowhere else to go. So how did we get here? How did a plan to create two states turn into this endless nightmare? It started with a decision made by people who didn't live there. The British and the UN decided the fate of Palestine without asking Palestinians what they wanted. And when Palestinians resisted, they were crushed. When they fled, they weren't allowed back. When they stayed, they were occupied. And when they fought back, they were called terrorists. Israel was created as a refuge for Jewish people after centuries of persecution and genocide. That's real. That matters. Jewish people deserved safety. They deserved a homeland, but it came at a price that Palestinians are still paying. And that's also real. That also matters. This isn't a story with clear heroes and villains. It's a story about trauma, fear, and survival on both sides. Israelis live with the memory of the Holocaust and the reality of rocket attacks. Palestinians live with the memory of the Nakba and the reality of occupation. And both have been trapped in a cycle of violence for over 75 years. The international community keeps talking about a two-state solution, but on the ground, it's hard to see how that's even possible anymore. The West Bank is carved up by settlements. Gaza is isolated and destroyed. Jerusalem is divided and contested, and neither side trusts the other. Some people now talk about a one-state solution, one country where Israelis and Palestinians live together with equal rights, but that seems even less likely. Most Israelis don't want it, and many Palestinians don't trust it would actually be equal. So the situation continues, the occupation continues, the blockade continues, the violence continues, and millions of people on both sides just want to live normal lives. They want their kids to grow up without fear. They want to go to work, see their families, have a future, but they can't, because the conflict won't let them. There's no easy answer here. There's no simple solution. But one thing is clear, what's happening now isn't working. It's not sustainable, it's not just, and it's not leading to peace. If this opened your eyes, hit subscribe because there's so much more to this story.